On the one hand, um, we all do have degrees of personal responsibility. This decolonizing notion is always about expanding our frameworks. Because remember, colonizing practices are imposing one framework on a group of people. So I put these in quotes because on the one hand, personal responsibility is an important thing in a lot of ways. But I put it in quotes here because it's like the mental health field, I think, sometimes uses this concept and this notion with blinders on, right? And so um, when we talk about someone trying to shift or change or heal, um, and they have a certain personal responsibility to that, I think when this becomes problematic is when we, of course, don't include history, context, intergenerational trauma, current marginalization and oppression, an educational system, right, that still relegates us to kind of marginal status at best. So if we just look to this notion of personal responsibility without context, it further invalidates the experiences of the people that we work with. Similar to this idea that just not ready for change, just not ready for change. This goes to the notion that we were talking about before about help offering behaviors, right? So we continue to, we do our typical offering of behaviors and then clients still talking around the problem as we talked about before and kind of talking indirectly. Then we can come to the conclusion, well, they're just not ready for change, right? Again, that's a very decontextualized. And my invitation is that anytime we have these notions arise within our thoughts, like personal responsibility and not ready for change, anytime that happens because of our training, our experience, for that to be kind of a light bulb or something like, okay, oh, I'm thinking that, is that really what's going on? Or is there something more? What do I need to explore? What do I need to contextualize? Right? Um, then we all, I think a lot of us in the field are familiar with this when clients begin talking about everything else that's happening in their lives, people that are they're having problems with. It's always like, well, we can't change other people. Let's focus on you, right? Again, that can be helpful. Sometimes that is necessary. But my suggestion is that all these responses can also be very lazy responses on our part because it's easy to say, well, we can't change other people, let's just focus on you. And it can also come off as patronizing and invalidating, right? Because sometimes the issues are outside of that one person. And while it's true, you can only have a conversation with the person in front of you from an individualistic perspective. From a collectivistic perspective, you can bring anybody into the room, right? What would your mother say if we are having this conversation? Why would she believe that you can make this change? How come your tío doesn't believe you can make this change? What about your abuela or abuelo, even if they're alive or dead? If they were in the room, what kind of conversations would they have with you? So that we can be more collectivistic in our work. Of course, the whole idea of doing work in therapy is capitalistic, right? Um, because what can that mean? Well, it can mean that the person needs to put some effort, right? There needs to be some move or you remain stuck. And that makes sense. I mean, a lot of the times there does need to be work that's done. But again, when it's looked at in kind of in a myopic kind of fashion, where all the onus is on the client, right, to do the work, or the whole process is doing work, then the assumption or the implication is that counseling is only successful if you're doing a certain type of work. And that kind of work always, the way it's often used is not is usually not contextualized to the client's life and their experiences, right? And so these are all very similar. Client readiness. Who decides if a client is ready, right? A lot of the times when we say clients aren't ready, it's really us that aren't ready for this type of client, right? Because of what they're moving toward. Um, and this one I keep saying myself, but this is also another kind of colonial concept, is this idea of ownership. My clients, our clients, well, they don't really belong to us, right? They're people. We're working with people, right? And these are all things that, if we use these concepts, it's not that we're terrible or evil or, this is kind of the language that is typical in the field. But I think we need to look at everything, and even the word client, but right, but the clients that I work with, they're not mine. They don't belong to me. Um, and the reason why that's important is because actually we know very well in counseling and in therapy that the framework that we use can open up possibilities and curiosities and questions. And so if we continue to use a framework of ownership, then there's still some aspects of us, whether consciously or unconsciously, that are going to reinforce that power differential. That's going to kind of reinforce, um, it's going to kind of take away, I guess, the agency that the person in front of us, that they have, right? So so we try to move away from ownership language. Um, Goals, very like goal directed. I love goals. I construct therapeutic goals all the time with clients, but the way in which they could be problematic is when the goal becomes the focus solely, and I'm looking at the process only as a results oriented process. And results are like, this is what I want to see at the end of this process. And if we don't reach that point, then there was a failure somewhere, right? Um, if that's the framework that's being utilized, then that is can become imposing. Right? And so that is not going to really lead to kind of decolonizing our practice. And again, this notion of always having direct communication as better, as best, as a default taken for granted assumption that direct communication is always the right way to communicate. How many times have you heard the notion of indirect communication used in a positive sense? But in fact, 2/3 of the world have more of a collectivistic framework of communicating um, than our Western individualistic way of communicating, right? So I've said this before, like I think certain practices like I statements can have their value, especially they can have their value with if the person in front of you comes from an individualistic framework. I statements work beautifully, right? Um, but I caution against use. That's one of those blanket practices where sometimes it can be healthy or useful, and sometimes it's a way for us to indirectly, quote unquote, teach clients how to speak uh, properly or how to speak better, right? Um, because direct communication does two things. One, it can, in the healthiest way possible, help a person connect with their own emotions, right? So that what they're feeling is what they're saying. Very healthy, right? But two, direct communication also allows us, the therapist, to understand the client better, right? So when we're pushing this kind of direct, accurate communication, we need to ask, who are we doing this for? Is this an actual therapeutic goal for the client? Or are we doing it because we think the client needs to communicate so that we understand what the client is saying? Is it more for us or is it more for them? Because if it's more for us, then that's when we might be imposing a certain framework of communication that may be culturally inappropriate.